Wonderful. Okay, sorry about that little delay, everyone. Welcome back to JWA's Quarantine Book Talks. I'm Judith Rosenbaum of the Jewish Women's Archive. Very happy, as always, to be back with you tonight for the third session of our summer series. Please, as always, say hello to us in the chat box. Give us your name. Let us know where you're coming from. And as usual in the chat, please also drop your questions during our conversation, and we'll try our best to pull them in. We are delighted to be able to continue gathering together from all around the world for these really rich and meaningful conversations. Before we begin tonight, I want to say a few words about JWA for anyone who is new or needs a refresher about what exactly the Jewish Women's Archive is. We are a digital archive that expands and transforms the way we understand history and Jewish culture by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories. We believe that uncovering a more diverse story helps us create a better world. So thank you for joining us in our efforts to do that. The Quarantine Book Talks are just one small part of the work that we do, and I very much encourage you to check out jwa.org to explore the full range of projects and resources that we offer. I am truly delighted to welcome Courtney Zoffness, the author of Spilt Milk, to our book talks tonight. Spilt Milk was named a Best Debut of 2021 by BookPage and Refinery29, and a must-read by Good Morning America. Zoffness, who is also a fiction writer, won the 2018 Sunday Times Short Story Award and has many other honors, including an Emerging Writers Fellowship from the Center for Fiction and 2 residency fellowships from McDowell. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Paris Review, the Southern Review, Guernica, No Tokens, and other venues, and she has essays listed as notable in Best American Essays in both 2018 and 2019. She holds graduate degrees from the writing seminars at Johns Hopkins University and the University of Arizona, and she has taught English at a dozen different institutions, including Yale and the University of Freiburg in Germany, and has delivered readings and talks across the U.S. and abroad. She currently directs the creative writing program at Drew University, and she lives with her family in Brooklyn, New York. Welcome, Courtney. So glad you're here with us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me.
So this is a really beautiful book that addresses so many topics and how they weave together, from motherhood to art and creativity to embodiment to anxiety, inheritance. How did you come to write this book? I know that you mostly define yourself as a fiction writer. So did you set out to write a memoir, or did you kind of fall into it as you were writing the essays?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I didn't realize when I was working on pieces that, eventually coalesced into this book that I was actually even writing a book. I was working on a fiction project, and at the time I became pregnant and then became a mother, and then that happened all over again. As these things do, and just find motherhood to be really intense and profound, and had all these sort of questions that I wanted to gain some clarity on. I wanted to tease out the knots in my own understanding, and so I just sort of organically turned to the essay, which is a form that I've always loved to read, and one that I think resists clear answers. It chases questions. And I felt like that was the space I was inhabiting. So I was writing these on the side. And then when I read a few of them together to do an event like this, I realized that they had a lot of themes in common, and that the other ones I had started shared those same themes, and that there was a book in the making. I mean, I think our preoccupations, their origins are kind of hard to determine, but I think all humans and all writers have them, and they just recur and shapeshift, but still recur.
Yes, I sometimes feel I like to write essays, and I sometimes feel like I'm actually just writing the same essay over and over again in different permutations and from different angles, and it's like, okay, I guess that's my that's my story.
That's a book. Yeah.
But how great to discover that you were writing a book when you already had written a lot of the book. That seems like a good place to start, not at the beginning necessarily.
It is. That's right. And I do sort of appreciate the organic nature, that I wasn't trying to fit, something into a form that didn't work for it, right? Like I wasn't chasing a certain kind of book. I was just sort of emerging.
And that seems like it's very organic to motherhood as well, which is, for all that we might plan, um, you know, the journey of motherhood takes one on many adventures, and brings together so many different aspects of your own experiences and experiences from generations past and what you see in the world around you. And I really loved how much you were able to weave together from the most personal kinds of pieces about, how you pass on your own anxieties, and also like how you are looking around at the world and trying to figure out how do you interpret it for your children, like in your essay about your son's obsession with the police in your neighborhood, and trying to figure out how to teach him about racial justice and law enforcement, and white privilege. Did
Yes.
you have
Ongoing.
that? Sorry, what did you say?
I said ongoing.
Yes, I am sure.
Ongoing.
And I think, that much like writing the same essay over and over again, I'm sure you'll have some of the same conversations in different permutations over and over again.
That's right. Sort of age appropriate versions.
Right, exactly. I love that one of your epigraphs was a Yiddish proverb. A mama had Eugen von Glas, a mother has eyes of glass. Why did you?
Glad you're not asking me to pronounce it.
I can.
I just said I'm glad you're not asking me to pronounce it, because
Why did you choose that as an epigraph?
I loved the sort of opacity of it. A mother has eyes of glass. I mean, to me, it almost sounds like it's like it challenges the idea that a mother can see clearly, to me, even though I think that may be the spirit of it. But if you have glass eyes, you actually can't see. So I think the ways in which it plays with what we think we know, or I mean, I can speak only from my own experience as a mother, but like what you think are the right choices, what you think you're observing, and the ways in which none of that may be accurate.
Mm-hmm. Right, or you can only see from the moment that you're in, and the perspective is partial.
Right.
Yeah, I wasn't sure what to make of that phrase either. I couldn't decide if it was about actually sort of being all seeing, or clear or opaque. It's a little unclear.
I think it's meant to be clear, like the context in which I like, of course, Googled around, but I love that that's not how it reads. I mean, that to me is the beauty of poetry, that you can flip a phrase and see it on either side.
Right. One of the phrases that I really loved in your book that I felt played around with that a little bit too was when you, in the essay about your son's anxiety, when you said, "I am both his nature and his nurture," and that sort of caught me, because I was thinking about how so often we see those things sort of posed against one another, or as a kind of binary, and then to recognize that no, they're indistinguishable on some level, that they're we can't separate out the things that we are giving, that are that become part of the air around us, and our bodies themselves.
Yes, and I think especially for young kids, like I'm, telling him how to be, not to say that any child has to do what I say, but I'm modeling it. I'm encouraging going in this direction, not that direction. So, in that way, I'm very literally the air around them.
Mm-hmm. I always felt until I had kids, I really believed absolutely everything was socially constructed. I would have died on that hill. And then my kids were born, and they were just completely themselves. And it was fascinating to be like, oh, okay, I need to kind of revise my theoretical understanding of how identity works, and recognize that there are these components that are sort of magical and completely catch us off guard, and that seem so deeply rooted. And sometimes there are things that are incredibly familiar, and sometimes there are things that are incredibly foreign, and that mix is just mysterious.
It is, and I see that in my family, having two sons who are just 2 years apart, with the same parents in the same home. And I think those differences are really explicated.
Yeah, I have twins actually, and
Oh
they
my
could
gosh.
not be more different. And people are always sort of asking me about that, and I'm like, well, it's not exactly a big sample size. It's a sample size of two, so
Right.
I'm not really sure that we can draw a lot of conclusion. And one is a boy, and one is a girl. So I don't think we can draw a lot of conclusions about differences other than they are just siblings who happen to be very, very different. But it is just a bizarre and fascinating thing.
Mhm. I smell a book.
Yeah. In several of the essays, you also write about your relationship with your mother. And so the motherhood theme goes both forwards and backwards. Um,
Yes.
and I particularly loved the essay about, that was called Ultrasound, about your mother's own art as a singer and songwriter, which she never shared with you. And you write that you learned from her that art is something you do in secret. Um, and clearly, you've taken a different lesson from that. As much as she may have tried to teach you that, you've flipped it a little bit on its head since you're publishing and publishing about yourself. Do you think of what you're doing as in relationship to your mother's art, or do you see yourself as consciously choosing a different kind of path?
Not consciously, though it's certainly a role, like the role of mother, and that relationship in particular is something I think a lot about. Uh, yeah, and I also want to say that I don't think that was a lesson that she consciously taught me either. I think she, was insecure and maybe didn't want to share it and didn't think she sounded great as a previous singer. I think there was a lot going on there. Uh, and, who knows if that informed a choice that I made. She's a very creative person, and outside of music and making visual art, she was the person who was always pulling the car over to the side of the road to point out something beautiful or something interesting. And I feel like she really gave me a certain artistic lens. So even as I feel like she didn't um, sort of make her art accessible in the ways that I'm doing, I do feel like she made me an artist, if
Mm,
that makes sense.
yeah. It was also so interesting to hear about how you, in the years before the internet, couldn't find her music anywhere, and which I think is just fascinating from a historical point of view to remember there was a time when we didn't just have every piece of information at our
Oh
fingertips,
yeah.
and findable.
Yeah.
Um, but also as a metaphor for just the parts of our parents' lives that are never going to be accessible to us, that we have to kind of like hunt around to find little hints or little um, trails
Totally.
that are left, and how different I think that's going to be for the next generation in a certain way. Obviously, there will still be unknowable aspects of experience, but there will be so much more that is findable. And I'm curious if you think that kind of like radical accessibility changes how we experience art and, I mean, clearly the world, but I guess I'll limit it more to art.
Gosh, that's a big question and a hard one. If I think uh, accessibility to individuals changes how we experience art, is that what you're asking?
No, I think I just mean more to like all the content of what is produced, and the kind of like cultural material that we might not have been able to just have at our fingertips at a
Yeah, I
moment's
mean,
notice.
it has definitely changed the game a quadrillion fold. And especially since so many people live their lives online. So having that sort of persona accessible to future generations is a sort of a strange notion to contemplate. This is kind of an adjacent point, not exactly, but it's making me think of this wonderful essay I just read by Carmen Maria Machado, who's a fiction writer and a memoirist. And I think she just wrote it on her blog, but it was in response to another writer who had a novel all set to be published, and it got pulled at the very last minute because it was determined there were sections plagiarized, and that this writer whose book was pulled having some mental health issues. But Carmen used that sort of the story around that, to talk about the ways in which writers, and I would say artists in general, sometimes feel this impatience to just be in the world, as opposed to sort of attending to their art. And I do think this is something that artists struggle with, the ways in which we may be told by industry professionals that we need to have an online presence and we need to have followers, even as all of that shit, can I curse here, is really taking away from attending to the thing that they want to be launching in the first place.
Right.
And just the sort of challenge of that duality. And Machado's advice was really like, ignore all that chatter and make the art as good as you can make the art. And that's the only way that it will have a life.
Right. Now that's really interesting. I think about this all the time. Also, just, I feel like at JWA, we're able to create all kinds of content in different forms, including through social media that is, carries out our mission and is so of a piece with everything we do in different arenas. But then there's like the pressure of how to represent that as an individual. And like, for me, I used to love to be on social media, and then I sort of hit this wall about a year and a half ago where I was like, I can't do this anymore. But there's a loss there too of not being able to kind of swim in that water and be influenced by, sort of all of the exchange that happens there. And that question of sort of where do you put your energy and what kind of content do you want to be creating? And, how do you, right, we have limited energy, and where do you put it? And like, what is the medium of art that is going to be most fitting for what you want to convey?
Yeah, and especially in pandemic times, I think it was the way so many of us relied on interaction.
Right, exactly. I think about this also for so many writers like yourself who are also teachers and teachers of writing, that you're sort of practicing two different art forms, like being a writer yourself and then also being a teacher of writing. Do you feel like those two things go sort of seamlessly together, or does it feel like there's a tension between teaching writing and writing yourself?
For me, they go together seamlessly. I know many people for whom they do not. And a lot of writers who teach because it's a way to have reliable income. I love to teach. In some ways, I wish I didn't love it so much because it takes up a lot of time where I could be doing other things. But it forces me to read closely. I always intentionally design syllabi. In fact, this is what I was doing this morning for my classes that start at the end of the month. I always intentionally put new work that I haven't taught before, sometimes even work I've been meaning to read. So I use it as an opportunity to continuously engage with work that I think has value. And that I think nourishes my writer self. So for me, they're very symbiotic.
That's great. Let's look a little bit at one of your essays. I was thinking particularly about your essay, Holy Bodies, which actually takes place at the community mikvah Mayim Chaim, which is here in Newton, where I am located. And it's an organization that is a partner and friend of ours at JWA. So it was really lovely to read that piece. You write about immersing there and about the story of its director, Carrie Bornstein, who's served as a gestational surrogate. So would you share a little bit of that piece with us, and we can talk about it a little more?
Yeah, sure. I guess I don't need to set it up. I'll just read from the opening. It's called Holy Body. Holy Body. The instructions framed on the sink are more thorough and explicit than you'd expect. Use the tissues to empty your nose and the toilet to empty your bladder, they say. Use the shower to lather and rinse every limb and strand, ears, elbows, genitals, toes. There are supplies, Q-tips and cotton rounds, toothpaste, a toothbrush, floss, a comb. There is nail polish remover to delacquer fingernails and toenails, and cleanser to clear away makeup, and a pumice stone to slough dead skin off your heels. There is a dish for the items you're asked to remove: eyeglasses, wedding bands, dental plates, hearing aids. Quote, there should be no physical barriers between the body and living waters. You should be as naked as on the day of your birth. There are also meditations, 7 of them. 7, the number of steps you will soon descend into the water. The figure represents wholeness and the creative process according to the text framed on the sink. God, and this is a house of God, took 6 days to create the world, but made his work complete on the 7th, the Sabbath, a day of rest. You are dubious about God, but believe in completion and the creative process. You are, for example, writing a book you hope to finish. Both physical and spiritual directives have the same aim, to cleanse and prime and hone your focus. The suite in which you stand has also been occupied by the dying and the barely survived, by the grieving, by the newly married and the freshly divorced, by the abused and the barren, by those who are mid-transformation and the transformed, by the reverent, by a woman who went blind in midlife, a fate you cannot fathom, and a paraplegic whose wife is expecting twins. Quote, in the mikvah, every body is a sacred vessel. You may hear echoes of these folks as you undress, see shadows behind folds of the shower curtain, flashes in the mirror. You may wonder about the words that they held in their mouths when they stood where you are. Try, though, to concentrate on your own words, on your own mouth. Heed the meditations. I'll stop there.
Beautiful, thank you. So why did you choose to write it in the second person?
You know, sometimes it's hard for me to, I mean, I can explain the work it's doing. Sometimes it's hard for me to explain why certain craft choices emerge. I think in some ways I was receiving commands, right? Do this, do that. So that sort of lent itself to my talking, like advising myself in some ways. I see this second person as sort of a bifurcation of myself, right? It's me talking to me, or me talking to you. Mm-hmm. And I think also since the mikvah is a communal space, it's sort of bringing someone with me on this journey.
I love that. It also felt that maybe it's interesting, I hadn't thought about this until you said bifurcation of yourself, but also that you were sort of surprised to find yourself there on some level. It wasn't like something that you are normally doing. And so to kind of be like acknowledging your presence there as a bit of a surprise.
Yeah, I mean, I can set it up a little for viewers who haven't read it, which is that Carrie Bornstein, who directs this very modern mikvah center, served as a gestational surrogate. She and I went to a Jewish sleepaway camp when we were young girls, and I was just fascinated by her decision to do this as already the mother of 3 children for a couple of strangers she'd never met, and basically showed up to learn more about how she got here and why she was doing this, and then figured I'd take a bath while I was there. But I found it to be very beautiful, the whole experience.
Yeah, Maim Chaim does an amazing job of being, I mean, part of what they're there for is to make mikvah accessible and to expand the ways we think about taking this ancient ritual and using it for modern purposes. And making it something that's open for anyone, not people who necessarily would find themselves in traditional ritual spaces. I loved also that you structured the piece around the meditations that are provided. One of the background things also is that Maim Chaim provides really beautiful rituals for all different kinds of settings, and many of them have multiple parts that you can read as you walk down the steps. So how did you think about weaving that into the piece?
You mean the 7 meditations? Mm-hmm. This was a little bit of a late stage decision because I mean, it winds up being, it's a very long piece. It's the longest one in the book. I think it's something like, 12,000 words. And there was so much I wanted to say that I kind of needed a structural scaffold to fit these pieces in. And so I was like, what if I tried this? I mean, this is sort of a peek behind the curtain, and to see if there was a way to organize it that way. And it wound up also inviting in other elements that I hadn't considered just from my musings and notes. And I thought it seemed really apt for, the content.
one of the things that you did with some of them is sort of argue back against some of the meditations. Like there were a few that were a little too God centric for you. So you're like, not that. And actually, it appears sort of as a strike through in the text. And I love that too, because it was part of how you make something your own is figure out like what piece am I inviting into this as something that I'm going to try out, words in my mouth that maybe I haven't said before, and which ones am I like, nope, that's not going to work for me.
Yeah, I mean, to the credit of the staff at Mayim Chaim, to Carrie in particular, she literally gave me a Sharpie and was like, edit, which is, as a writer, who doesn't love a good edit? But it did make it feel like I was doing it in a way that felt appropriate and comfortable and meaningful to me. And I think the aim of a center like this is to create individually meaningful experiences, right? So I think I really appreciated that option.
At several points in the book, you sort of talk about your relationship to Judaism as being, kind of inconsistent or ambivalent in various ways, which of course to me seemed like, well, isn't that the quintessential Jewish experience? Right? Like we argue with tradition and we're ambivalent in all kinds of ways, and why not about Judaism too? Especially because to write about it means you're taking it really seriously and engaging with it and exploring what it means. And I'm curious, first of all, about whether writing those pieces kind of shifted, sort of taking Judaism into account in your writing in this way. I don't know if you've written about Jewish themes before, but whether that sort of shifted anything for you. And then my second question is about whether becoming a parent changed your relationship to Judaism.
Yes, on both accounts. The first is that what shifted is when I gave like an early version of this manuscript to some very good friends of mine, like first readers, they were all shocked by how much Jewish content there was, because and in fact, I was too. So I think, in my day-to-day life, this is not like something you would immediately learn having a meal with me, right? This is not, central to my daily existence, at least in my mind. But it's something that becoming a mother really caused me to wrestle with, because, if you have two boys like I do, you have to make immediate decisions in the hospital about a bris or no bris, a circumcision. And, even while pregnant, which is sort of the origin story of this book, I was already thinking like, what am I going to do? And having to, you can't reverse it. So you really have to make a choice. And so I had to make a choice. And I do think that in part speaks to why I meditate on some of these issues in a book that is very much about motherhood and the role a parent plays. But both my kids are we're members of a beautiful progressive synagogue in Brooklyn, and they're going to Hebrew school, and here we are, ambivalent and here.
Right. Yes, a very Jewish way to be. And I will say that my experience is that I've been, because of the work that I do and my life, is that several times people have accidentally called me Jewish instead of Judith. So I've had the opposite experience of being like, I guess I walk around in the world somehow projecting a like very frontal Jewishness, so much so that people mistake it for my name.
I think you really need to change your Zoom screen name.
Exactly.
That's very funny.
One of the other pieces that I found so powerful was the essay called Hot for Teacher, which is sort of almost a kind of litany of experiences of being targeted as a woman, and was so resonant and felt to me in some ways like a very kind of concretized snapshot of what Me Too was all about, which is that like when women start to go sort of cycle through their minds and think back over their lives and take all these experiences that may have just seemed unpleasant but sort of quotidian in some ways, and line them all together, it's kind of shattering. And I'm curious what it was like for you to write that piece, and what the response has been.
So incidentally, that piece initially appeared in a wonderful Me Too anthology called Indelible in the Hippocampus, which was what Christine Blasey Ford said about the laughter that she heard of Brett Kavanaugh's. And what's also interesting is that when the editor of that anthology, Shelley Oria, invited me to contribute, it occurred to me that I had a piece that had been just like hanging out on my laptop for years. And until the Me Too movement, I hadn't really known what to do with it. So, I mean, there was a lot I added, in part because by that point I'd become a mother of sons who I was and am very intent on raising to be respectful towards women and understand what is and is not okay. So that was an important layer that I think is really central to sort of how I move through the world now. But yeah, the experience of writing it, what was the experience of writing it like? I felt angry writing it. In particular, and the most egregious example was an OBGYN who is now serving too little time, but time in federal prison for over 100 women he sexually assaulted while they were under his care. And he was my OBGYN. And it just deeply creeps me out to remember all of those visits to his office. So I think, fortunately, I was not one of his victims, though he was very weird with me. I mean, how could he not be?
Right.
Yeah, so I think it was, a satisfying, like, anger barf writing it. And it felt necessary too. And I very much appreciated that the movement made space for these kinds of stories.
Right.
And I shouldn't put it in the past tense. I think it continues to make space.
It does. Though it's hard to hold, right? I think it's interesting to see what sustains and where people pull back because it becomes either too complex or just too painful to hold so much. And I was thinking, as you were saying this was part of an anthology about Me Too, I was thinking, oh my gosh, what must it have been like to edit that, right? Because I know, even just working at the Jewish Women's Archive, which is a repository of stories, during the height of Me Too, when we were and are still collecting Me Too stories, it felt like we were just carrying a lot of pain, and sort of I felt a responsibility to kind of hold that on some level for people, and just to recognize, like, when our work is about thinking about how all the individual stories add up into this collective, incredibly rich tapestry. And I think about that usually as such a positive, beautiful, just such a diverse and colorful archive that we get to build out of, and history that we get to build out of everybody's story. And then to sort of have the dark underside of that be like, it is very colorful and it is very varied and it is very heavy sometimes. And to kind of own that is incredibly hard, but also so powerful to put it out there and be able to help people make those connections for themselves or see their own experiences in a light that they haven't been able to see it in before.
Yes, for sure.
And I think that sort of leads me to some other questions that I had for you about writing itself and sort of why you write. And you had so many lovely little kind of passing reflections on that in the book, talking about, you wrote in one place, like, I write because I prize language's surprises and limitations. And I just loved that sentence. And you talk about trying to unravel knots in understanding, and you talked about storytelling as the most insistent tool I have. And I thought those were all just like such sharp and clear descriptions of writing as serving a real purpose and sort of doing, helping you do work, not just being the work itself. So I'd love to hear a little more about sort of how you think about the the writing that you do and how it serves you, how it serves others?
I can't speak for how it serves others. But, this ties a little to what you were saying earlier about, stories that are about or have emerged from the Me Too movement and the diverse but heavy tapestry of that. I think one theme I find myself writing about a lot, both in my fiction and my nonfiction, because I'm also a fiction writer, is these really like unclear power dynamics. And it just seems, because there are Me Too stories that are so clear cut, there are also so many that are so complicated. And that is a space I feel like is so important to write into. And there's a way in which, like, a quick, bit of reportage is not going to capture that, but a story with complicated characters in whose minds you are forced to inhabit, and to move around with them, it can engender, I don't know, a certain kind of understanding that I mean, it's something that literature provides for me for a variety of situations that I'm not personally familiar with. So I don't know if it's a service I provide, but it's something that I think is sort of essential for me to do as a writer, and it feels pretty compulsive.
Yeah, I appreciated that in your work, like the sort of like lingering on the messiness of things. And um, I think we live in a time when there's a lot of hesitance about doing that, I think, on some level. Like people want things to be, and maybe this is just always how people want things, but I think we are living in a particularly, um, just a moment of such, because things are so messy, people want things to be clear and stated very, definitively in some ways.
Yeah.
And I think about, this is one of the things we talk about at JWA all the time, sort of that part of our work is about bringing nuanced conversation to things, and that it's all about the nuance, means it's all about complexity, which means we can't come away with easy answers, and it's really hard, and it's not going to always be clear, and it's kind of muddling through. And maybe this is back to the kind of Jewish ambivalence thing. It's like also embracing the aspect of Jewish tradition that's about wandering in the wilderness, that like you don't always, it's not always about like getting to the place, the promised land, and maybe the promised land, even if you get there, isn't as great as you thought it was. That everything is actually more complicated, but you have to kind of, the only way to get anything from that is actually to be in it,
Right.
and to acknowledge that. And I think part of what I found interesting sometimes about the way you talked about language is, like, on the one hand, language is a way to put a frame on things and try to control it or bound it, or create structures that make it make something more comprehensible, and yet you're also like writing into the complexity of things, so there's a little bit of tension there, I think.
Gosh, I have so many thoughts on all of this, but just immediately, there's an allusion to that process too, because language is so limiting, and there's so much not in this book, that is really intimate and personal, and informs a lot of what is in this book. And people read it and say, I feel like I know everything about you, which is like 90% of my life is sort of off screen.
Right.
So even though I'm using language to try to sort of express complicated situations, experiences, observations, and I think I do, it's still curated. But also to the idea of nuance and complexity. I mean, this is why art lives, right? I mean, I think the best literature is, and art of all kinds, visual art and music, just goes into all of these sort of clashy spaces, and resists like singular conclusions.
Right. I think it's part of why I've been reading so much fiction and poetry during the pandemic. Like, I mean, partially it was like the news was too bad, but I actually read a lot of really scary, I mean, not scary like, horror, but scary like dystopian kind of things, and or just life things, which are scary. And
Life is pretty dystopic.
right. And but there is something about, like, when you experience it through literature, it is very different than reading it in the newspaper. There's like a different kind of imaginary energy that comes from it that just, I don't know. I'm losing the language of how to speak about it, but I feel that very.
No, but listen, we read about fake characters who we know are fake, and we cry about their stories, like real tears.
And miss them when we finish the book, right? Like so many times I'm like afraid to come to the end of the book because then I'm like, I'm going to lose this person.
Right. So yeah, it's doing a lot of like inner work.
Yeah. And I was thinking about the title of your book too, in terms of thinking about this question of messiness, because the title is Spilt Milk, right? You know, so obviously referring to the adage, you know, don't cry over spilt milk, or you shouldn't waste tears, or whatever the expression is. But you're focusing on it because in some ways you're like kind of giving some attention and significance to the messiness, and not saying like, oh, it should just be, it's not a big deal, just kind of blow by it. Were you seeing that as a kind of critique, that it's like okay to embrace the mess and not dismiss it as inconsequential? I guess I should ask, what does the phrase mean to you, or sort of why did you pick that title?
I think it does, of course, wink at the adage. Is that how you say it? I only ever write it. Adage. There's no use crying over spilt milk, which to me evokes childhood and parenthood, right? But I think embedded in that advice is like, move forward, get over it. And I think there's a lot, and probably considering your professional position, I suspect you'd agree, there's a lot of value in looking back in order to look forward. So, you know, I saw this phrase coming up, speaking of news, in news stories when like Colin Kaepernick took a knee at an NFL game, and, you know, there was a lot of commentary like, slavery was so long ago, spilt milk, get over it, right? So it's sort of like big scale and then small scale, little messes. But I think this is how we evolve as individual humans, and hopefully as a species, by really paying attention to how we want to do better and be better.
Yeah. There's also a piece in one of your essays to take it back to a more, you know, sort of literal level, and you know, maternal level of spilling a bottle of breast milk, and
the worst thing ever.
The worst. Yes.
Liquid gold.
Yes, there is some milk that is worth crying over spilling sometimes.
Right. True. Yeah.
Yeah. Also on the theme of writing, one of your essays is about ghostwriting a memoir for a Syrian Jewish man. And I am so curious about your experience as a ghostwriter and how writing someone else's story compares to writing your own, or to writing fiction.
It was really difficult, in part because I had to write in the first person as a Syrian Jewish man who was significantly older than I was, who's had like 3 languages before English, you know, that he used to communicate. And sometimes I would, you know, I interviewed him copiously, read a bunch of books, both that he gave me and that I found. Aleppo, which is the city of his birth, you know, was far more complicated than I realized. But it, you know, it wasn't just like trying to write a fictional character, say, of my own making. I had to capture him, and then he would read it and let me know if I had.
Right. It's like having a very early critic built into the process.
Oh man, but because I am not him, you know, I wouldn't know what I was doing, like how to do it well. But it was an awesome experience for my, like, I think for me as a writer, because, you know, I learned a lot about sort of how to write towards, you know, somebody's objectives. And he also wanted a story that was written in a melodramatic way, which is not my default mode. Yeah, so I found it to be a supreme challenge. It took way longer than it was supposed to. And ultimately he decided he didn't even want to publish it, though, he paid me along the way. It was more like, I guess you'd call it a vanity project. He bound it and like shared it with his community, because it was the story of how he escaped Aleppo in the early 70s with help from the Israeli Navy.
We have a question about the title of the book, although it sounds like it is not available to the public.
Oh, his book is not available to the public. Yeah, no.
Yeah. And folks should feel free to put other questions in the chat. But it seemed from the essay that you also really got a sense of the world that he came from.
For sure. I really did. I've never, it was also, I think the lens through which I was revisiting it was when the Civil War began, and suddenly Aleppo was, being spoken of constantly. Whereas I think before that, except for maybe in a certain Sephardic community, it was not, a city that I'd heard talked about much. And seeing images on TV of the way it had been destroyed, I felt this like real devastation, even though I'd never visited, which I do think, again, it probably ties in some way back to our earlier conversation about what literature does for us, both creating it and consuming it, right, and the ways in which we can feel attached.
Right, like you had to enter into that space and develop a personal connection to it in order to inhabit his story for him in some way.
That's right. Yes.
But also, I guess, brings up interesting questions of representation, which came up. We did an online history course in June about Jewish women on film and television, and the question of representation came up a lot, of just sort of who is chosen to play certain kinds of characters and who gets to tell whose story. And I hadn't thought about it necessarily in terms of ghostwriting. It comes up obviously in the news in terms of fiction writers also, who's allowed to tell what stories. But it is such an interesting thing to hire someone else to write your story, and to them expect them to be on some level able to, depict your memories in some way, even if they are not from that place, don't speak that language, not the same gender, not the same, like have so many different experiences.
Yeah, lots of hurdles. I'm not sure that's how everybody goes about it. I mean, this was pretty unofficial. It wasn't like I was hired by a publisher to help a celebrity, which I think is often how books get ghostwritten.
Right.
But yeah, I think the challenges abounded.
Yeah. What are you working on
now? So I'm back to working on fiction, but at the beginning of this call, I had said that I have a lot of thoughts about this idea of like writer's work, in part because I'm working on my tenure application, which is due next week. And I'm working on motherhood and syllabi preparation. And I do feel like I am also working on fiction in like fits and starts, and hopefully more so when I finish this tenure application. But I think especially for working parents and working moms, I think there's a way in which life can be so consuming. And I mean, it's not like I have a large platform, but I do feel like it's important to normalize sort of the ebbs and flows of an artist's life. And so I've also been doing a lot of events for the book, which have been really delightful. And it comes out in paperback in September. Awesome. So I'm working on fiction. The project is still pretty amorphous, and I'm also working on lots of other things related to my work and my life.
I appreciate that answer very much. I think that, our culture is so like product driven, sort of production oriented, that it is very hard sometimes to remember that things do not move along in a linear way. And I used to think this when I was writing my dissertation, and would, spend days researching something in the archive that then like maybe made it into a footnote, or not even, like ended up being a total dead end. And it's hard not to feel like it's wasted time, but then you're like, no, you really have to just see it as like it's part of the process. And
That's writing a book.
Right. You
Yeah.
know, I had terrible writer's block during the pandemic, and I would just think, like, just sitting here staring at the screen and writing words and then erasing them and writing them and erasing them, that's part of the process. And that was productive because it worked through whatever I had to work through today, even if I didn't get to where I thought I might want to go. Because why am I thinking about where why am I thinking about the destination instead of the process of getting there?
It's hard advice to take in the moment, without a doubt. Though I also think, to the extent there are any aspiring writers tuned in, that this same essay by Carmen Maria Machado that I mentioned at the beginning is very much about, like, do you want to just put out a book, or do you want to put out a really good book, a book that you can always feel really proud of, like you debut once? And, I do feel like, not feeling like you have to race to the finish line uh,
Right.
is useful to think
Yeah.
about too.
And I think also it's also part of that question about like why you write. Like, do you feel like when you sit down to write an essay, you kind of know what you want to say, or do you feel like you figure out what you want to say
I
as you're
never
writing?
know what I want to say.
I don't
Yeah,
know.
I never do. I never do. I think sometimes I have a question I'm chasing, um, or a theme that I'm interested in, or an experience that I don't really understand.
Right. Yeah, that's my experience as well. That it's like I can't wait until I think I have some notion of what I actually am doing before I sit down to do it. But then somehow something emerges eventually. Um, what what was the hardest part of this book? Like, did you get to a point of feeling like you had most of it, but there was something that you were that took sort of longer to pull into it?
The hardest part was writing Boy in Blue, which is an essay about my young son's obsession with dressing and acting like a police officer. I live in Brooklyn next to a police precinct station. And, my block was closed off for Black Lives Matters protests, and hadn't accounted for all the ways in which weaponry would be at my kids' eye level every time we walk up and down our block. But it was very hard for me to figure out how to communicate to him why I had issues with his doing this, or whether I should not communicate that at all, because it's just imaginative play. I think, he's a boy and he's a white boy. And, I knew what that signaled.
Right.
So I also think it's very complicated and should be very complicated to write about racial justice. And it was really important for me to include it, and also to get it right.
Mm-hmm.
So, a la your dissertation footnote, I read so many books, and this had so many different shapes. I have versions, like dozens and dozens of pages that have nothing to do with what, I published, but informed what I published.
Right. Yeah. Um, yeah. And I guess that's part of the challenge of trying to write to the moment. Also, right? It's like you're writing about it, and we're still in it, and so you don't have the distance of like making sense of it. It's like you're in it in the moment as you're writing. You're in it when your kid is asking you a question, and you have to answer them, figure out what you're going to say in that moment, and it's not. That gets back to the messiness thing. Like isn't going to come out in always in the way that you might theoretically plan it if you had years or the perspective of decades or whatever.
Yeah, and even if I did, I'm not sure there's like a single way to do it. I can think of plenty of wrong ways, or ways that I would opt not to choose, but I'm not sure if there's a single way.
Mm-hmm. Right. There's
But I
definitely not
did.
one way.
Definitely not one way. Yeah, I think I struck a compromise between letting him play, and also, expressing reservations or play acting certain roles that I felt like might complicate his understanding of this system and institution.
Were you writing much of this during the pandemic? And if so, how did that impact your process?
I wasn't. I was editing a little bit in the pandemic. I think the life of a book from completion to publication is like just unfortunately so long
Mm-hmm.
uh, that, you know, I finished it and I think it was like in copy edits when the pandemic hit, but then it still takes like, 9 months for it to appear on bookshelves, like this sort of thing.
Right.
Um, but I think it did make it into one or two essays, just a little bit
Yes, there
at the
definitely
end.
was some references here and there. So I wasn't sure, and I know that right to be working on a big project that you might be working on from home, and then to be on lockdown, it changes the whole nature of the and to be on lockdown with a family
Oh,
changes
it
the whole nature of
does.
of the
Oh
project.
my gosh. God bless school in
Well,
person.
yes, I want to thank you, Courtney, for sharing your really beautiful book with us. For those of you who haven't read it yet, I highly recommend it. It's really gorgeous and so readable, and the kind of book you want to go back to and reread. And I want to thank all of you who are with us tonight for being part of the conversation. Um, as always, I encourage you to explore further at JWA. For example, we talked about mikvah. You can learn about mikvah in general in our encyclopedia. And you can also learn about Mayim Chaim in particular, the mikvah that Courtney visited. And you can read several reflections on our blog about feminist reclamation of mikvah. And now Courtney's essay is another part of that canon of thinking about what mikvah means in 21st century America. Um, I hope that many of you will join us next week, same time, same place, for a discussion with Sam Cohen, the author of Sarahland. I will actually be away next week. I will be in Israel, but you'll be in great hands. We've invited JWA friend and colleague Helene Myers to moderate the conversation. Some of you may remember her from our history course in June, and I'm sure it will be great fun. So please come back. I will be back with you in just a few weeks for our amazing September series, which we will be announcing soon, but which has some fabulous and books that are eagerly anticipated. So please register for that when you see the announcement. And until then, be well, stay safe, everybody. Good night, and thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. And thank you so much, Judith, for having me. It was a pleasure.
It was really wonderful. Thanks, Courtney. I really loved the book.
Good
Good
night,
night, everybody.
everyone.